Sugarcube Corner. A bright and cheery voice greeted the pair as they entered the large and ridiculously proportioned building. Samba could hardly believe his eyes when Fluttershy pointed out the cafe and sweet shop as an excellent place to get breakfast. "Oh, Fluttershy! And a new pony!" She had, however, also warned him of her friend's exuberance and almost terminal need to greet new arrivals. As it stood, there was now a painfully saccharine pink mare invading his personal space with her ferocity of a sugar-coated blitzkrieg, and Samba was finding it very hard to decide between retraining his secrecy versus trapping her mind in a realm of fear and trauma. Pinky?" Fluttershy reached over and, thankfully, pulled the pink one away from him. "I know you're excited, but Mr. Amox doesn't really like ponies getting too close to him. He's a little like me in that." Samba almost laughed at the idea. He was much like his servant, but she wasn't wrong in respect to that. To Fluttershy's words, Pinky seemed to calm considerably, though her tail twitched occasionally with what Samba could only assume was a sugar rush. "Oh, sorry about that," Pinky said with an apologetic smile. "My name's Pinkie Pie, but you can call me Pinky. Welcome to Ponyville." She stuck out a hoof, to which Samba raised an eyebrow. "I believe Fluttershy introduced us just a moment ago." Apparently undeterred by Samba's cool demeanor, Pinky left her hoof outstretched as she gave a short nod. "Yep, but my Grandpappy Pie taught me that you should always greet with a proper hoof shake and not to use another pony's name until they've given it to you. Otherwise you're being disrespectful." Samba's eyes widened in unconcealed surprise at her words. "I see," he replied. "Well, in the interest of respect," Samba reached out and gave Pinky a firm hoof shake and found a surprisingly strong grip behind it. "My name is Cole Amox, Scholar of the Crystal Empire. Quite pleased to meet you." "Whee! A new friend!" Pinky immediately lost all semblance of decorum and began bouncing around the dining room of Sugarcube Corner with the elasticity of a large marshmallow. Finally, she came to a stop behind the counter. "Now what can I get you? Everything is hot out of the oven." "I'll have a strawberry muffin and a cup of Earl Grey, please," Fluttershy said, and lay a few bits down to pay for the meal. Pinky dished out Fluttershy's order and set it on a tray before turning to Samba, who was examining the wall-mounted menu and display casing. "Don't worry about your order, Cole." Pinky grinned before vanishing back into the kitchen, then returning in a rush. "I've got just the thing for you right here." Samba opened his mouth to protest her presumption, but the words died on his tongue as she saw what she had added to the tray. He was stunned. He was a king, and yet this small pink mare had managed to keep him on his back hoof nearly the entire time she'd been in her shop. Humming a lively tune, Pinky carried the tray over to the table Fluttershy picked out by the window, and set out the food. "One strawberry muffin with honey butter, as usual, and a cup of piping hot Earl Grey." "Thank you, Pinky. This looks perfect." Fluttershy's smile radiated before blowing softly on the tea. "And for Mr. Amox, 2 fresh crystalberry scones and a cup of coffee." Pinky slid the order in front of Samba, who stared down at the nostalgic food in front of him, unsure how to feel about it. "Want any cream or sugar with that?" "Oh, no thank you. I prefer it black," Samba answered distractedly before lifting the scalding drink to his lips and taking an attentive sip. It was perfect, bitter and fresh, just like he remembered. Not a hint of burnt grounds, with just the right ratio to keep it from being too watery or too strong. Setting the mud down, he lifted the scone and took a small bite off the corner. Crystallized sugar danced on his tongue, and the sweetness offered by the warm, nutty bread. Samba closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he wasn't in Sugarcube Corner. He wasn't even in his crystal palace. No, he was home. That small, worn-out, half-buried hut that its wood stove sat in the middle of the single room, so delightfully warm as it chased out the dire chill of the eternal snows that blew in the Arctic North. His father's rich voice reading out scriptures from the Book of Harmony as his mother pulled out a fresh batch of scones from where they had been baking. He munched quietly on his scone as he listened to the familiar words from his brothers and sisters, all curled up together warmly. "You're Cole?" Fluttershy's voice broke through Samba's memories. Samba snapped back to reality. He was looking down at the scone and felt a faint, unfamiliar twinge around his eyes. Glancing up, he saw both mares staring at him, Fluttershy with concern and Pinky with worry. Were they not good? Pinky asked softly. Sombra could hear the fragility in her voice. I can make a new batch if they weren't. No, they're perfect, Miss Pie, Sombra answered a little unevenly. He set the scone down and wiped his hoof on a napkin, lifting his hoof back till he found wetness around his eyes. Tears? That wasn't possible. Are you sure? Pinky asked again. I've never made some pony cry with a scone before. Well, except for the baked bad incident. Sombra chuckled quietly. I'll be most interested in hearing that story someday. But no, it's just been a very long time since I've crystal berry scones. Very long indeed. During Master Sombra's reign, industrial pollution poisoned much of the land where crystal berries grew. The crystalberry bush is a temperamental thing, you see. Very specific conditions were required for it to grow properly, and so its berries became quite rare and difficult to acquire. Eventually the king gave up trying to grow them in favor of more readily available crops. Crystalberry scones became more of a byword for a different time by the end of it all. Pinky's face lit up joyously. Wow, that's really sad, but it's also really happy. I guess. I'm so glad I could make them for you then. They're really popular since the Empire came back, and when you said you were from there, I got really excited. I could finally ask some pony who actually remembered them if they tasted right. I really wanted them to be authentic. Then I must admit, you have succeeded remarkably, Miss Pie, Sombra answered. Nuh-uh. Call me Pinky. Miss Pie is my mom. Pinky's smile had returned in full force. Well, technically she's Miss Quartz Pie, but anyways. I was really worried because I woke up this morning and my ears were all twitching, and my left hoof tingling, which means somebody really needs some good comfort food, and I thought I messed up. I'm glad I didn't. Sombra was about to ask what that could possibly mean when he was cut off by the chiming of the coroner's bell. A pair of ponies walked in, one with a very light, fair coat with a two-tone pink and blue mane, and the other with a sea-green coat and a light sea-tan mane with a streak of white. Oops, more customers. See ya, Cole. Pinky gave an exaggerated flux salute before vanishing back behind the counter. Well, that's Pinkie Pie, Your Majesty, Fluttershy said with a soft laugh. Only at her happiest when she's making other ponies smile. Yes, I can see that, Sombra answered quietly as he took another drink of his coffee, followed by more bites of the scone. Fluttershy? The mare in question looked in surprise. Yes, Your Majesty? About earlier, Sombra began as he stared down at his half-eaten scone, when I triggered the guys on you. Fluttershy swallowed. She didn't really want to revisit the event. In fact, she'd been doing her level best not to think about it until he brought it up. Yes? Lashing out in such a manner was unworthy of me, Sombra said quietly. I apologize. Sombra couldn't recall the last time he had said those words. I apologize. Once they had been familiar, common words spoken amongst ponies who lived and laughed and worked with one another. But a king does not apologize. He does not excuse his actions to his lessers. A king acts and accepts that no decision can be made without both benefit and cost. So long as both are weighed and accounted for approximately, then there would be no apologies to be made. Doing so would simply be taking out means of regret for necessary sacrifice, and Sombra never made a sacrifice that wasn't necessary. He coldly spent the lives of his subjects like coin, true, but he was a miserly and frugal spender. Every lost pony was a lost artisan, engineer, teacher, soldier, or laborer. Every one lost diminished his empire. Fluttershy, for her part, looked completely stunned. Whatever she expected him to say, he guessed that an apology was probably far from her mind as a possibility. I do not require you to accept my apology, Sombra continued, lifting his eyes to meet her wide blue eyes. Those blue eyes that pierced him in such a familiar way. Yes, Somber thought. That's right. Beryl had blue eyes too, didn't she? I wonder how I could have forgotten that. I suppose it just didn't seem important. Finally, Fluttershy found her voice again, after processing the king's unexpected words. You hurt me, my king, she began, and surprisingly, Somber felt a small pang in his chest at his words. I know that we aren't friends, and I know exactly what kind of relationship we have. You've been nothing but frank and open about your expectations and your rules, so I shouldn't have expected any other response, but I did. I don't know why, but I did. I apologize for the hurt, Mouse, Somber replied evenly. Do not press your fortune. Fluttershy shook her head. I didn't mean the guys. It hurt, but I can get over that hurt. I meant the fact that you did it, that you triggered the guys. I guess it just drove home that I really am nothing but a servant to you. That was what hurt, Your Majesty. I am a king, Mouse, Somber growled. Whatever that pink friend of yours believes, I do not have the luxury of friends, especially not given my past. No friend of mine would last long under the kind of strain. That doesn't mean you don't need friends, Your Majesty, Fluttershy replied softly. Maybe if you had friends, you wouldn't have become such a... She cut herself off. I'm sorry, I overstepped myself again, Your Majesty. It won't happen again. Irritated, Somber gave a snort and returned to his coffee and scone, taking solace in the nostalgia and peace of the past. Miserable as it may have been for the most part, he had just started in on his second scone when he felt Fluttershy's hoof cover his. Glancing up, he wondered at her sad expression. I do forgive you, though, Your Majesty, Fluttershy said, favoring him with one of her small smiles. Somber didn't respond, only grunted in acknowledgement before returning to his scone. He was determined to finish the last one while still warm, though for some reason it seemed to taste better than the first one. As they left Sugarcube Corner, Somber seemed to be in a much better spirit. Fluttershy was glad for that. She had been afraid she had gone too far when she told him that she knew they thought of her as nothing but a servant. That wasn't really true, whatever he pretended, and Fluttershy knew it. If it were, then he would never have responded to her kindness. He certainly wouldn't have apologized. This, Fluttershy mused as they made their way toward the furniture store in the midst of the slowly walking Ponyville, was probably one of the reasons she wasn't the element of honesty. If she wanted Somber to appreciate friendship, then, just like Discord, she couldn't let him walk all over her. He had to understand that his actions could drive ponies away from him, too. Just because I'm kind doesn't mean I don't know how to put my hoof down after all, Fluttershy thought to herself, remembering the business with the Breezies. If I'm going to help Somber, I need to be able to stand up to him, and that means it's going to hurt sometimes. Maybe I'm just imagining it, but I can't help but think that he inflicts pain because it's all he's ever known. That's an awful sad thought, but it's not too different from taking in a pet who was at a bad home, I suppose. Fluttershy was so lost in thought that only the intervention of Somber's hoof on her chest kept her from running headlong into another pony as they turned the corner to the main market square. Oh my! Fluttershy stepped back to attention and realized that she had nearly stumbled into... Rarity! I'm so sorry, I wasn't paying attention. The graceful white unicorn shook her head. That's perfectly all right, darling. And who is this? Oh my. Rarity gave Somber her up and down before batting her generous eyelashes at him. This charming stallion here prevented any problems from arising. Somber merely inclined his head in acknowledgement. Well, I'll try to be more mindful anyway. It's that, okay? Fluttershy answered. Of course, darling. Now, what are you doing out so early? Rarity asked, bemused. I don't see you in town very often, usually on the afternoons. House call? Oh, no, maybe I should introduce you two first. Fluttershy glanced back at Somber, who gave a shrug and a small nod. This is Cole Amox, from the Crystal Empire. Cole, this is my good friend Rarity Bell." Rarity had scarcely lifted her hoof before Sombre took it gently in his own and lifted it to his lips, placing the barest whisper of a kiss on her fretlock. "Quite a pleasure to meet you, Miss Bell." Oh my." Rarity blushed fiercely and gave a nervous laugh. "You're very welcome, Mr. Amox. But please call me Rarity. I can tell you're from the Empire. Such manners are so rare out here." "A shame," Sombre answered with a rakish grin. "A lady of your poise and radiance ought to be treated as such. That is my own opinion, of course, but please call me Cole. Mr. Amox just sounds so uptight, does it not?" Rarity fluttered her eyes at him with a demure laugh. "Well, I shouldn't think so. I think your last name is quite nice, and I certainly lament that so few often your opinion are decorum and courtesy. We simply must get together one of these days. May I ask how long you're in town?" "I'm not certain, to be honest," Sombre answered easily. "I'm an Imperial scholar here to study the unique flora and fauna of the Everfree. In truth, I imagine I could simply settle down and spend a lifetime doing so and not catalog half of the species in that expanse. But of course, I do have duties to my peers and my kingdom." "A scholar? How wonderful!" Rarity was beaming. It had been a while since Fluttershy had seen her like this. Her friend was smitten. The last time was Trinderhoof's. Fluttershy hoped Rarity kept her wits about her this time around. Trinderhoof was strange, but ultimately a nice pony at heart. Sombre was not. "Well, I would love to pick your brain about Imperial styles and fashions, if you ever have a moment." "I'm afraid my expertise lays in the more arcane arts of lore, my dear," Sombre answered with regret that even Fluttershy almost believed. His ability to adapt a persona was almost impressive, if it wasn't so eerie. That, and very little fashion occurred within the Empire during the Age of Shadows, I'm sorry to say. The only thing most ponies were wearing were manacles and chains, hardly chic. "Oh yes, I suppose that would be the case," Rarity answered, her tone taking on a more gentle and commiserating tone. "I couldn't imagine living such a life. I'm sorry I brought up the matter." "Not at all. What is past, and I prefer to look toward the future," Sombre answered readily, his grin actually genuine. Fluttershy suppressed a shudder, imagining what kind of future Sombre was looking at. If she was honest, Fluttershy felt a little sidelined by the conversation. Not terribly unexpected, but after Rainbow Dash, Fluttershy could tell when Sombre was buttering someone up, and Rarity did have a weakness for high-class stallions, although how the king had managed to pick out that from a glance was beyond her. His accuracy was frightening sometimes. Fortunately, it seemed to apply more to others than to himself, or her, for some reason. Fluttershy logged that tidbit away as she spoke up. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we came into town to find a bed frame from Cole," Fluttershy said, drawing a quirked eyebrow from her friend. "I offer him room and board in my cottage while he does his research, since there is nowhere else for him to stay that's anywhere near the forest. I have a spare mattress, but I never took time to find a frame for it because it was so big and I never needed it." Rarity laughed. "And they call me generous. That's such a wonderful thing you're doing, darling. And as it happens, I'm in such the same boat. I was out to buy a new bed for Sweetie Belle." "Oh, did she outgrow her old one?" Fluttershy asked conversationally, as they began moving toward the furniture shop together. No. It caught fire and burnt to a clump of ashes, actually," Rarity replied with an air of resigned frustration. "Crusaders?" Fluttershy asked. "Crusaders." "Well, I suppose it was bound to happen eventually," Fluttershy lamented, patting her friend on the withers. "I'm a little surprised that this is the first bed she's gone through." "I managed to get the tree sap out the last one," Rarity answered with a shrug. "And the time before that, I discovered that crude oil actually comes out of fabric quite easily with some dish soap and hot water. Unfortunately, no amount of elbow grease can rebuild ashes." "Your sister seems to have a common attribute for destruction, Rarity," Sombre remarked with a wry grin. "Oh dear me, you have no idea," Rarity remarked, waving her hoof. "My sister and her friends are wonderful fillies, truly, but their capacity for ruination is almost supernatural, except for our cooking. Actually, in that case, I am absolutely certain there is something otherworldly occurring. I've seen burnt toast. I've never seen toast so thoroughly ruined it become liquid. Surely you're joking, Sombra remarked with a laugh. When both Fluttershy and Rarity glanced at each other uneasily, his smile faded. You aren't. How peculiar. Sweetie Belle once tried to make me a salad, Fluttershy said with a haunted tone in her voice and her eyes fixed on some distant point. I can still hear the animal screaming. There, dear, Rarity gave Fluttershy a reassuring hug. It's over now. Giving a last shudder, Fluttershy nodded and returned the hug as they approached their destination. The furniture store in Ponyville was really more of a specialty shop for carpentry and woodwork, run by a friendly, dun-colored unicorn named Maple. Given that most of the furniture one would own in Ponyville was made of wood, she made a decent living, even in the shadow of barnyard bargains. Their goods might be cheap, but tended to be of commercially lower quality. Most Ponyvillians preferred hardier goods to cope with the more rough-and-tumble life in a small town on the edge of the Everfree. The shop wasn't large, mostly used as a display room, while Maple had her workshop in the back where she kept the sellable wares. Morning, Fluttershy, Rarity, Maple announced cheerily, poking her head out of the back room at the sound of her front door bell. Who's your new friend? Trotting out, Maple shook some wood chips free from her dark mane. Cole Lamox, here on research purposes from the Crystal Empire. Sombra stepped forward and shook Maple's hoof. Miss Fluttershy was kind enough to offer me room and board while I studied the Everfree Forest. Since I'm not sure how long I'll be in town, I opted to spend some of my expenses on a bed frame for a large mattress. It's about 75 by 80 inches, down-stuffed, and about 44 pounds. Fluttershy offered, stepping up next to Sombra. I don't suppose you have anything in stock that fits that. I'd like to be able to give my guests more than a mattress on the floor tonight. Glancing up at Sombra, she stared a little as their eyes met. Oddly, he seemed as surprised as she was, and quickly looked back at Maple, who was perusing what looked like a hoof-ridden ledger. Not wanting to rush her, Fluttershy turned back to Rarity, who was looking at both of them with a sly smile on her face. What's wrong? Fluttershy asked, quirking an eyebrow. Rarity giggled. Oh, nothing, my dear. Just keeping my eye open for something of interest, that's all. Turning to Sombra, she asked, Cole, dearie, would you mind waiting here with Maple in case she finds something appropriate? I need to borrow Fluttershy. She and my sister have very similar aesthetic tastes, and I wanted her thoughts on the new bed. Of course, Sombra replied graciously, shooting a glance at Fluttershy. I'll be right here when you lovely ladies are finished. Flattery will get you everywhere, darling, Rarity remarked with a wink before trotting off, Fluttershy neatly in tow. I'm pretty sure you have a better eye than I do for what your sister would want, Rarity, Fluttershy said as they neared the small section of the shop with display frames. Of course I do, darling, Rarity responded with a wave of her hoof. No, I want to talk about that dashing stallion who can't keep his eyes off of you. You have no idea, thought Fluttershy, a little dryly thinking of the guys. I'm sure it's nothing like that, Fluttershy said softly as they moved amongst the woodwork. We've only known each other for a few days. I know, and to be perfectly honest, I'm quite surprised you're so willing to give him a board at your cottage, Rarity said. After all, I do know how you are with strangers. At first, I'll admit, I was a little worried he had bullied you into it. But quite frankly, I don't think I've ever seen you so relaxed around any pony who wasn't one of us. This was news to Fluttershy. Did she really look relaxed? It felt like she'd been on tender hooves since yesterday morning. Really? I hadn't noticed. Well, that's my point, darling. Even you didn't notice, and here we are. There must be something quite special about that stallion for you to be so at ease around him. Rarity leaned and gave Fluttershy a gleeful nuzzle. I'm so proud of you. Either way, you really come out of your shell lately. I'm sure he appreciates your kindness. I certainly hope so, or this is going to end very differently from what you expect, Rarity, Fluttershy thought dourly. She gave her friend a brighter smile, though. Well, Cole actually is not hard to get along with. He's very quiet, polite, and hard-working. Sometimes I forget he's even there." Surprisingly, Fluttershy realized as she was speaking that everything she said was perfectly true. More so than she had thought when the words had formed. "Yes, very polite, not accounting for the mental enslavement part." Fluttershy couldn't help but feel a little annoyed and said how easily the master— darn it, no, stop that! Sombra was winning over her friends. Rainbow, Pinkie, and Rarity all thought he was great. She was finding herself less and less impressed they had managed to rise to rule an empire, and more impressed they had ever lost. No offense to princesses, of course. "He's quite charming as well," Rarity noted with a sly smile. "But don't sell yourself short either, darling. Cole is quite taken with you, I can assure you. I see the way he looks at you when you're not looking." "What?" Fluttershy's eyes widened in surprise. "I'm sure you're mistaken, Rarity. He's very nice, but, a little distant." "Pish-posh!" Rarity scoffed, waving her hoof again. "He's a stallion. Of course he's distant. They're terribly fragile creatures, but there's nothing against him. Cole strikes me as a very old-fashioned type, and I think that's quite perfect. The gentility, the gradual and deliberate shows of affection, why, a lesser mare might be jealous." "Oh, Rarity, old-fashioned doesn't even begin to cover it." Fluttershy actually had to stifle a laugh when her friend had said that. "Well, he won't be around forever, Rarity. He's just here on business, and after that he'll be leaving. And hopefully I'll be still here after that." I don't know about that." Rarity eyed Fluttershy sideways with a supple grin. "I seem to recall him remarking, how he could settle down and spend his whole life here, doing his work." A flush crept up Fluttershy's cheeks. "I think he was just talking about the Everfree. It's so very big and, unique. I don't think even Zecora knows everything that's in the deeper parts of the forest." "Well, we'll see." Rarity smiled as she turned away from Fluttershy. Sombra was trotting back toward them, just behind Maple, who was holding some papers out in a sunflower glow. "Here you go, Flutters. I have a bed frame that fits the bill in stock. Your friend is quite the haggler. The frame can be delivered to your cottage by early evening at the latest, and I threw in one of my associates to set it up. Your friend paid out front, and you're all set." "Oh, thank you, Maple." Fluttershy took the warranty and delivery papers, along with the receipt. "I suppose we will, Rarity." "Ah, excellent. And I know exactly what I need for my sister as well," Rarity said jovially, making her way over to the counter with Maple. "I quite like your town, quaint and humble as it is," Sombra said as Rarity left earshot. "It reminds me of home." "Really?" Fluttershy asked, honestly interested. "But the Empire is so big. Ponyville seems like such a smaller place in comparison." Sombra's face took on the nostalgic air that he had worn while eating the scone. "Now, of course it is. But once it was not so different. Even your friend's castle is reminiscent of the original Crystal Palace before the expansions. Before the Crystal Heart was created, the Empire consisted of nothing more than a palace in a small town, not much larger than Ponyville, cobbled together around it." "Oh, I had no idea," Fluttershy said softly. "Was it nice?" "Aside from the near constant blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, I suppose it was nice, yes," Sombra answered wryly. "Our leaders were not terribly competent, but enough. Perhaps I'll speak more on the subject later." Rarity had returned with her own receipt and sun-dry papers. "Well, since we're all still here, I say we go out and have a quick brunch. I have some time before Sweetie's bed arrived." Fluttershy was about to agree as they stepped out of the store when Pinkie Pie appeared, interrupting her. "Oh, I finally found you!" Pinkie looked out of breath and a little worried. "Spike showed up a little while after you left. Twilight said she's convening an emergency harmony council immediately, and we all need to be there. Rainbow's already heading to Sweet Apple Acres." "Oh my!" Fluttershy looked at Sombra and Rarity, the former which looked vaguely disinterested. "Is it really that bad?" Pinkie shrugged. "I don't know. Spike just said go." "Well, so much for brunch," Rarity remarked. "I suppose we should be off then. Do you think Twilight would mind if Cole comes along? I would feel dreadful just leaving him in the middle of a strange town." "Sure." Pinkie answered gleefully. Now we can introduce you to every pony. Oh, good, Sombra answered with a slightly strained smile. Fluttershy couldn't help but giggle and throw a hoof before leaning against Sombra. Don't worry, she whispered. Twilight and Applejack a lot more toned down than Pinkie. Still, Fluttershy wondered now that meeting Applejack would probably be the largest hurdle. Misleading every pony else was one thing, but the element of honesty was the most stubborn of all, and a knack for seeing right through a pony. Of course, should the truth come out, Fluttershy couldn't think of a better place for it to happen than in the middle of the castle, surrounded by her friends. Sombra wasn't the only one who could plan ahead.